People in the Roman and medieval era were tiny, they were small, diminutive folks, and us giant modern people would tower over them. Bullshit. So folks, obviously regular viewers of my channel will know that I predominantly talk about military history and antique weapons, this kind of thing, but I am an ex-archaeologist, and when I was studying archaeology, one of the things I had to study was skeletons and data and looking at Museum of London reports, and I was educated at university at UCL knowing certain facts about the size of ancient and medieval people. I specialised in the medieval period. And as I have covered in previous videos, I have covered this, but it keeps coming up. Medieval people were not significantly shorter than modern people. And yet there is this, I imagine coming from the Victorian period, this modern pervasive idea that we somehow tower over medieval people. It's not true. Okay, I'm going to give you some facts and figures. But before I do give you some actual numbers and refer to an article linked below, linked to a report, and this is from the University of Oxford website, so it's all highly reputable and well researched. But before I go into that, I want to make one caveat or one other point, and that is these are averages. Okay, when people talk about averages, you have to understand what an average is, and inevitably in any period, just as now, you get some people who are 7 foot something and you get some people who are 4 foot something. Okay, I am from the United Kingdom and our very own Queen I think is less than 5 foot. She's tiny, and yet I know I have some friends who are nearly 7 foot tall. This has always been true. So when we talk about averages, we're literally talking about, you know, the shortest and the tallest and everything in between, and that was true in the medieval period as well. And you have to remember, in pre-modern medicine days, people who suffered from conditions which meant that they ended up very small, or conditions, medical genetic conditions that ended up making them very big, they weren't treated medically. These days they are. If someone is growing too fast, then they're given certain medical treatments that slow down their growth so that hopefully they have a good life expectancy. Someone who was essentially a giant in the medieval period did not have a good life expectancy. They would almost certainly not live beyond their 20s, if that. Equally, someone who was particularly small for some reason, many different genetic and medical reasons, could be related to disease, could be a genetic condition, they would be treated these days so that they would get a little bit bigger, hopefully, than naturally. But in the medieval period, that wouldn't happen. So we have to remember that the variables were bigger. There were probably, relatively speaking, in fact, we pretty much know this archaeologically, there were more sort of giants and small people, essentially. Whereas in the modern world, we deal with those variables and kind of bring people more into the norm for their own benefits for the large part, so they don't suffer so many side effects of being particularly big or particularly small. But going back to the data. So to reiterate, the link to where I get these facts and figures from is below, and that itself is referring to a study that's been done, a report. Now, I have long asserted that the general trend, and this is based on what I learned at university, and I have kind of gone back and researched it a little bit since then, but this completely corroborates what I was taught 20 years ago when I was at university. Essentially, people in the kind of early medieval period were not very different in average height to people today. Okay, that's the first assertion. The second assertion is that yes, indeed, average heights did decline with urbanization and industrialization. So generally speaking, in the after the Renaissance, with the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and the growth of cities, yes, indeed, sanitation went down, spread of disease went up, nutrition got worse, and so therefore inevitably people got smaller. And we see this in the modern world. This isn't something that's just connected to the passage of time and history, but it's something that's connected to human populations all over the world to this very day. We can find populations who are significantly taller than their grandparents were now, simply because they're better nourished now than they were before, or because the diet of that place has changed. There's famous examples in Asia where this is the case, where in certain parts of Asia where diet has drastically changed in the last 30, 40 years, and as a result the grandchildren are way bigger than the grandparents because they're eating different stuff. Nutrition is the one biggest factor, nutrition throughout life, not just at any given point, but since childhood. Nutrition seems to be the biggest impacting factor on how tall you get or how big you get, but also disease as well. Okay, right, so now some facts and figures. So first up, interestingly to me, in the Roman era, the suggestion is that during Roman control of Britain, so this is all based on averages across Britain, okay, but that's a good kind of one example to use, and it's comparing like with like, okay. So under Roman rule of Britain, it seems that the average height of men went up from 167 centimetres to 170 centimetres, okay, so that's roughly an increase of around 5'5", 5'6" to about 5'7", okay, so shorter than today, but it was an increase, and probably these increases, where there are increases, it's almost always related to improved nutrition, so better agriculture or more varied agriculture, and sometimes climatic change as well. And that is connected to nutrition, of course, because if the climate is better, if it's warmer, you can grow more different crops and you can eat more. Okay, and also you burn more calories. You require a larger amount of food in colder weather and stuff like that. Okay, what's interesting, so this is where we get to similar levels as today. If we look at the Viking era and going into the 1100s, so we're talking about the end of the Dark Ages, as some people would call it, or what archaeologists would usually call the early medieval period. So we're talking about the 900s, 1000s, so around the Norman conquest, or into the 1100s. The average height for men was around 172 centimetres, and it increased up to about 173 centimetres after the Norman conquest. Very interesting, I think. That suggests that Norman agriculture, or should we say at least agriculture in the 1100s, was perhaps more effective, or that the climate was more conducive to growing more crops. But anyway, 172 to 173 centimetres. So that takes us into the kind of 5'8" area. Now bear in mind, for context, when I was growing up, when I was at university, the average height of British men was 5'9". So what's the difference we're talking about here? 1 inch, okay? That's 2.5 centimetres. That's nothing, okay? In the grand scheme of things, that is a smaller difference than there is a difference between, say, British people's average and probably, let's say, Spanish people's average or something like that. You get more variation within Europe than that. And yet we're talking about 1,000 years of history. So in 1,000 years, British male average height varied was only different by about 1 inch, okay, which is tiny, which is nothing, it's insignificant, it's not worth mentioning practically, okay. Interestingly, in the 1200s and into the 1300s, it seems that there was a slight decline, so it went down by a centimetre or two during that period. We don't know exactly why, could be climatic conditions, but then after the Black Death, which was in 1349, the average height started going up again, and interestingly, in the period from 1400 to 1650, so that covers a lot of the late medieval period and into the Renaissance, or through the Renaissance, and into the beginning of the kind of almost the industrial era, the average height of British men was 173 to 174 centimetres, which is 5'9", which is exactly the same as it was when I was at university. Okay, now I should hasten to add, since I was at university, the average height of British males has gone up by 1 inch. So actually, the change of 1 inch has happened just while I've been an adult. Okay, so since I was at university, the average height of British males officially, according to, you know, records that we didn't have, obviously, before the First World War, which is when most of these records started being recorded, the average height of British males has gone up by 1 inch just in that period of time, you know, in the last 20 years, even less than that, okay? And yet, throughout the medieval period, it varied equally by about, say, 1 to 2 inches. in a similar range up to about what we are today. Now, I'm not going to go into, obviously there's a lot of data. There's in fact even more data for post-Renaissance, post-medieval average heights. And without a question, you know, without a shadow of a doubt, average height of people went down as the Industrial Revolution took off. People moved in from the countryside and into cities and lived in more cramped conditions, more disease, poorer nutrition, all of this, worse working conditions, getting less food, all of this kind of stuff. Yes, definitely, average heights went down. And I believe, certainly when I was at university, the low point, if I remember correctly, was about 5'4" for British males, which is obviously significantly, you know, that's half a foot, 6 inches shorter than the modern average. And that was in the 18th century, the height of the Industrial Revolution. Smoke in the air, very cramped living conditions, huge amounts of disease, poor, you know, horrible water, bad food, all this kind of stuff. But in the medieval period, the average height of men was basically the same as when I was growing up, and only very slightly an inch less. And in fact, in the late medieval period, in the Tudor period, it was the same as now. Okay, so I'm going to wrap it up there, but please spread the word, spread this video, and stop people perpetuating this myth that medieval people were small. Medieval people were not small, they were the same size as us. Yes, there may have been more big people and there may be more small people. We're talking about averages and these are statistics, but the average height of medieval males, certainly in Britain, was the same in the medieval period as it is now. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe. We have extra videos on Patreon and you can follow us on Facebook.